This is VOA News. I'm Marissa Melton. Hundreds of Ukrainians heard the Orthodox Christmas service in the Ukrainian language for the first time in decades at Kyiv's 1,000-year-old Lavra Cathedral. AP correspondent Charles de Ledesma has more.
Despite the frigid temperatures of minus 10 degrees centigrade in Kyiv, worshippers have overflowed the richly decorated Dormition Cathedral, also known as the Monastery of the Caves and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Kyiv resident Alex Fisniak says honouring the reclaimed church is important to many Ukrainians.
Now we feel that this is ours. This is Ukrainian. This is part of the Ukrainian nation.
Fisniak points out the service, held in the Ukrainian language, is another significant sign that the Orthodox Church there is gaining more weight in a society that desperately aims to cut ties with Russia.
The Ukrainian nation needs to come together.
I'm Charles de Ledesma.
The UN says one of its top officials has met with the Taliban-led government's higher education minister in Afghanistan, who ordered a ban on women in Afghan universities last month. The minister says the ban is necessary to prevent the mixing of genders in universities and because he believes some subjects violate Islamic principles. There's also a ban on Afghan women working for national and international non-governmental groups. The United Nations mission in Afghanistan said Saturday that the United Nations special envoy called for the urgent lifting of these bans in his meeting as the country is entering a new period of crisis. More on this story and all the stories we're covering at our website, voanews.com. This is VOA News. Iran hanged 2 men on Saturday for allegedly killing a member of the security forces during anti-government protests. Reuters' Freddie Joyner has more.
Iran hanged 2 men on Saturday for allegedly killing a member of the security forces during national protests that stemmed from the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini in September. Video that aired on Iranian state television Saturday showed 2 defendants identified as Mohammad Mehdi Karami and Syed Mohammad Hosseini testifying in court on an unspecified date in December 2022. Both were convicted of killing Ruhollah Ajamian, a member of the besieged paramilitary force militia. 3 others have been sentenced to death in the same case, while 11 received prison sentences.
That's Reuters' Freddie Joyner reporting. Thousands of Israelis protested on Saturday in Tel Aviv against the new government sworn in last month. Protesters took to the streets waving flags, banging drums, blowing horns, and chanting slogans against the new coalition and proposed judicial reforms to reduce powers of the Supreme Court. Israeli resident Inbar Shani.
We came here to protest against the degradation of the Israeli democracy. We see a process where the rights of the people will be over time consumed.
Protesters hope that through these demonstrations they would be able to oust the new government. And Damar Hamlin continues making progress in his recovery while remaining listed as critical, according to doctors. AP correspondent Julie Walker reports experts say heart screening may not have prevented the football player's collapse on the field.
Doctors describe Damar Hamlin's neurological function as excellent and say the Buffalo Bills' safety continues breathing on his own. The team's daily update also says he remains in critical condition at the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. Quick on-the-field emergency care, including being resuscitated in that game at Cincinnati on Monday, is widely credited with helping save Hamlin's life. But it's unclear if his cardiac arrest could have been prevented with screening. Cardiac testing, including EKGs and echocardiograms, can detect some but not all heart conditions. One fluke type of chest trauma is impossible to predict or prevent. I'm Julie Walker.
Thousands of Kurds from around France and Europe marched in Paris to show their anger over the unresolved killings of 3 Kurdish women activists in the French capital 10 years ago. The marchers are also mourning 3 people killed outside a Kurdish cultural center in Paris 2 weeks ago in what prosecutors called a racist attack. Police escorted a dozen buses bringing Kurdish activists from Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Belgium to Saturday's march. Marissa Melton, VOA News.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. China has reopened its borders to international visitors for the first time since travel restrictions were imposed at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in March 2020. Reuters correspondent Rachel Judah has more.
The easing of restrictions marks the final unraveling of the country's controversial zero-COVID policy. For the past few years, it's shielded China's 1.4 billion people from the virus, but also cut them off from the rest of the world. Now, incoming travellers will no longer need to quarantine, only provide a negative PCR test taken within the previous 48 hours. At Beijing Capital International Airport, long-awaited reunions at the arrivals hall that would have been impossible just a day ago are finally a reality.
Reuters correspondent Rachel Judah. Officials in Senegal and President Macky Sall said in statements 38 people died and about 80 were wounded in central Senegal after two buses collided in the early hours of Sunday. The crash, one of the deadliest in the West African country's recent memory, was on one of the main east-west arteries about 220 kilometers southeast of the capital, Dakar. The UN says one of its top officials has met with the Taliban government's higher education minister. VOA's Marissa Melton has more.
The minister says the ban is necessary to prevent the mixing of genders in universities and because he believes some subjects violate Islamic principles. There's also a ban on Afghan women working for national and international non-governmental groups. The UN mission in Afghanistan said Saturday the UN special envoy called for the urgent lifting of these bans as the country is entering a new period of crisis. Marissa Melton, VOA News.
This is VOA News. U.S. President Joe Biden is heading to the U.S.-Mexico border later Sunday for a first-hand look at border security. The stop in El Paso, Texas, will be his first visit to the border as president. Republicans have hammered him as soft on security, while a large number of migrants are crossing in spirals. El Paso is currently the biggest corridor for illegal migrants, large part because of Nicaraguans fleeing their country. They're among migrants from 4 countries who are now subjected to quick expulsion from the border under new U.S. rules. Allies of Britain's royal family are pushing back against claims made by Prince Harry in his new memoir. VOA's Tommy McNeil explains.
The book paints the monarchy as a cold and callous institution. Buckingham Palace has not officially commented on Spare, but British newspapers and websites brimmed Saturday with quotes from unnamed royal insiders who rebutted Harry's accusations. Harry has said he expects counterattacks from the palace over the book, which is due to be published on Tuesday. The Associated Press obtained an early copy of the book, which recounts Harry's grief at the death of his mother in 1997. It all describes the tense relationship with elder brother Prince William and growing disenchantment with royal life. Tommy McNeil, VOA News, Washington.
Australia's northwest is facing a 1 in 100-year flood crisis, according to an official, as many communities were stranded and prompted hundreds of evacuations, authorities said on Sunday. The crisis in the Kimberley, an area in Western Australia state about the size of California, was sparked last week by a severe weather system with a former tropical cyclone that brought heavy rain.
Now, as we know, people in the Kimberley are experiencing a 1 in 100-year flood event, the worst flooding Western Australia has had in its history.
Western Australia Emergency Services Minister Stephen Dawson, the Fitzroy Crossing, a community of around 1,300 people, has been among the worst hit, with supplies having to be airlifted due to flooded roads. Iraqi authorities have reopened Baghdad's heavily fortified green zone in an attempt to ease traffic jams in the capital. The heavily fortified area was closed and opened several times in the past years. Starting in the early hours of Sunday, Iraqi authorities removed checkpoints and opened major roads and tunnels that cut through the green zone. I'm Joe Ramsey, VOA News.
This is VOA News. Via remote, I'm Diane Roberts. Immigration is expected to dominate talks between North American leaders from Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. on Monday and Tuesday. U.S. President Joe Biden arrived in Mexico City on Sunday ahead of the two-day talks that will also include conversation about drugs at the U.S. southern border. Before flying to Mexico, Mr. Biden visited the border between the two countries in the U.S. state of Texas. He was met at the airport by Governor Greg Abbott, who handed him a letter of criticism over border policy. During his El Paso visit, President Biden told reporters the storming of government buildings by protesters in Brazil is outrageous. Dramatic video from Brazil's capital on Sunday captured supporters of far-right former President Jair Bolsonaro smashing into the country's Supreme Court. The sight of thousands of yellow and green-clad protesters running riot in the capital capped months of tension following the October 30th presidential vote.
E nós, inclusive, vamos descobrir quem são os financiadores desses vândalos que foram.
At a news conference, speaking in Portuguese, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said they're going to find out the financiers of the vandals who went to Brasilia, adding they will pay with the force of law for the irresponsible, undemocratic gesture of fascists. His words. The violence in Brasilia could amplify the legal risks Bolsonaro faces. It also presents a headache for U.S. authorities as they debate how to handle his stay in the southern U.S. state of Florida. After an epic 15-ballot election to become U.S. House Speaker, Republican Kevin McCarthy faces his next big test in governing a fractious, slim majority. That could come as early as Monday, when lawmakers are set to consider a rules package to govern the House. This is VOA News. Sudan's ruling military has vowed the army will come under civilian authority as the two sides hammer out a final agreement on a 2-year transitional government before elections. 3 days of talks between military and civilian leaders continued Monday with the aim of reaching a final deal on governing during a 2-year transition to elections. The spokesperson for the civilian side said in a press conference, quote, "This is an opportunity for all Sudanese to engage and cooperate with the regional and international community to achieve the high national interests of the country," end quote. At a launch of the final phase of the political process Sunday, Sudan's army chief repeated the military's vow to place itself under a civilian government. A major international conference on climate-resilient Pakistan, co-hosted by the United Nations and Pakistan, is seeking $16 billion to support Pakistan's multi-year effort to recover from last year's unprecedented flood disaster. Lisa Schlein reports for VOA from Geneva.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres opened the conference with an impassioned plea for aid on behalf of millions of Pakistanis whose lives and livelihoods have been upended by this calamitous event. He described this crisis as a climate disaster of monumental scale. He noted 1/3 of Pakistan remains submerged underwater more than 6 months after epic floods struck this beleaguered country.
A terrifying wall of water killed more than 1,700 people, injured thousands more, and affected a total of more than 33 million.
He said 9 million more people have been pushed to the brink of poverty, noting that they and millions of others are not just numbers on a page. Lisa Schlein for VOA News, Geneva.
International aid groups warn that millions of people in northern Syria could be completely cut from life-saving assistance should a United Nations vote fail to extend cross-border aid operations from Turkey. The concerns revive those of 6 months ago before the Security Council eventually extended the cross-border mechanism for another half year as demanded by Syria's ally Russia. A new UN vote was scheduled later Monday. Germany on Monday condemned Iran for using the death penalty against demonstrators.
UN Secretary General.
Warum den Fokus, den die internationale Gemeinschaft im Augenblick auf den Iran.
And a government spokesperson said Berlin wanted to crank up pressure on the Iranian authorities with new international measures. Iran hanged 2 men on Saturday for allegedly killing a member of the security forces during nationwide protests. Via remote, I'm Diane Roberts, VOA News.
This is VOA News. I'm Joe Ramsey. Ukrainian officials said on Tuesday its forces are facing waves of assaults by Russian forces as Moscow strives to make its first breakthrough in the east in months. Reuters correspondent Olivia Chan has more.
Ukrainian servicemen fired anti-aircraft guns at Russian positions on Tuesday near Bakhmut. The city is located on a strategic supply line between the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which make up the Donbas, Ukraine's industrial heartland. Gaining control of Bakhmut could give Russia a platform to advance on two bigger cities, Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. It would also be a welcome battlefield victory for President Vladimir Putin after a series of setbacks in recent months.
Reuters correspondent Olivia Chan. U.S. President Joe Biden and his Canadian counterpart are pledging to boost the futures of people throughout North America. AP Washington correspondent Sagar Magani reports.
The president and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau say they've worked together on several issues, from migration to climate change.
Demonstrating the unlimited economic potential that we have when we work together and in the hemisphere, and to help the entire hemisphere.
There's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, especially for those of us in our countries.
The two men showed an easy warmth before reporters, a stark contrast to yesterday's meeting between President Biden and Mexican leader Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, who has complained of abandonment and disdain for Latin America. Sagar Magani, Washington.
Brazilian police on Tuesday were questioning some 1,000 protesters held in an overcrowded gymnasium in the capital after anti-government mobs sacked public buildings over the weekend. This is VOA News. Zimbabwe signed a bill into law on Tuesday outlawing organized protest by healthcare workers. Reuters correspondent David Doyle has more.
Strike action like this could now see health workers in Zimbabwe facing a fine or up to 6 months in jail. The new legislation comes after a protracted battle over salaries. Thousands of doctors and nurses at state-run hospitals went on strike last year.
I cannot pay my rent, I cannot eat. So the situation is bad and our cause is justified.
Many nurses in Zimbabwe earn less than $100 a month. The southern African country has seen an exodus of nurses and doctors that has left hospitals understaffed.
Reuters correspondent David Doyle. Tigray forces who fought a 2-year war against Ethiopia's federal government began handing over heavy weaponry to the National Army as part of an African Union-led peace process on Tuesday. The demobilization of Tigray forces is seen as central to the November 2nd ceasefire agreement, alongside the restoration of services, resumption of humanitarian aid, and withdrawal of Eritrean troops who fought alongside Ethiopia's army but were not party to the truce. Iran has sentenced a Belgian aid worker to a lengthy prison term and 74 lashes after convicting him of espionage charges in a closed-door trial. VOA's Marissa Melton has more.
Iran's judiciary said on its website Tuesday that a court has convicted 41-year-old Olivier Van de Castel on charges of espionage, collaboration with hostile governments, and money laundering. He would be eligible for release in around 12 years. It's unclear if the charges are related to anti-government protests that have convulsed Iran for the past 4 months. Critics accuse Iran of using foreign and dual national prisoners as bargaining chips with the West, something Iranian officials deny. Marissa Melton, VOA News.
The French government on Tuesday announced plans to raise the retirement age to 64 and streamline the pension system, setting the stage for a major showdown with trade unions and a new wave of protests. Even some of President Macron's closest allies are known to be uneasy about the proposed changes, which come at a potentially explosive time so soon after the COVID-19 pandemic and amid high inflation. For the first time in 12 years since the last pension reform, all of France's trade unions are expected to make a joint call for strikes, which could start as early as next week. I'm Joe Ramsey.